Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to ASMR. Oh, today I'll be reading from my study guide for the real estate salesperson licensing exam. This chapter will be interests in real estate. There are many kinds of interests in real estate, and they're also known as estates or tenancies. These terms are interchangeable. Be careful of this and refer to the extent of someone's claim to real estate. Interests in real estate will be part of one of two major categories. Freehold interests, which refer to ownership, and non-freehold interests, which refer to possessory rights that don't include ownership and are typically for rentals. Note that having an interest in real estate doesn't mean that you own it. It simply means that you have some right to the property. Freehold interests confer ownership, and there are a number of different types. Fee simple absolute is the default type of ownership. It is also referred to as fee or fee simple indefeasible ownership. It is also referred to as fee simple indefeasible. Fee simple indefeasible and fee simple absolute are the same kinds of ownership. It is an interest in real estate that is not in any way limited and is inheritable. The owner is entitled to their entire bundle of rights to the property. These interests are intended to be indefinite and are only limited by public and private restrictions, for example, zoning and building codes. So that is the default type of ownership. It is in no way limited and is inheritable. Fee simple defeasible as opposed to indefeasible. This is fee simple defeasible. Unlike fee simple absolute, fee simple defeasible ownership is an interest in real estate that is limited in some way and can be lost if some limitation is violated or a condition is triggered. There are three forms of defeasible interests. Fee simple determinable, which is automatically lost when a limitation is violated. Fee simple subject to a condition subsequent, which is lost when legal action is brought pursuant to the violation of the limitation and returns the property to the original grantor. And fee simple subject to an executory limitation, which is basically the same as fee simple subject to a condition subsequent, except the property would be transferred to a third party named by the grantor rather than back to the original grantor themselves. I might start soft speaking because the whispering is not doing me much good. Life estates. Life estates are freehold interests that only exist as long as the owner of the property, also called the life tenant, is alive. The life tenant's deed will state who receives the life estate, usually a remainder man, upon their death in a habendum clause. There are different types of life estates. Life estates in reversion. A life estate where, when the life tenant dies, legal title or ownership will transfer back to the original grantor. That is life estate in reversion. Life estate in remainder. A life estate, or when the life tenant dies, a legal title will transfer to some third party originally named by the grantor. The third party is called the remainder man. Pour autre vie, an old French meaning for another's life. A life estate that is based not on the life tenant's term of life, but on some arbitrary third party's life as named by the original grantor. Legal life estate. Life estate created by law, often in cases of dower rights, where a serving husband or wife is granted a life estate for real property that was not willed to them, but that was owned by their spouse at the spouse's time of death. Sorry, my bad. In many states, a surviving spouse is entitled to dower rights, up to a 1/3 interest in their deceased spouse's real estate in lieu of what was left in the will. The right is inchoate or inactive before the spouse's death. Dower rights have been abolished in some areas of America, but still appear on the national section of the exam. Homestead. A legal life estate granted to the owners of a family home. It often provides protections from forced sale of a home to satisfy debts unto a certain amount. Usually, you can only have one homestead at a time. So, those were all kinds of life estates, different kinds. We have life estate in reversion, life estate in remainder, pour autre vie, meaning for another's life, legal life estate, and homestead. A life tenant has a present interest in the real estate subject to the life estate, while the remainder man, or the grantor in a life estate in reversion, holds a future interest. This means that the life tenant may not commit waste or cause the property to be damaged, legally compromised, or at risk of foreclosure, because it would compromise the remainder man's future interest. Otherwise, the life tenant may enjoy their full bundle of rights, less the right to devise, transfer in a will, the property. This is why it is important to understand life estates. Life tenants can sell, rent, or otherwise dispose of the property as they see fit, but anything they do while alive is undone upon their death. As a result, a client would probably not want to buy or rent property subject to life estate. Okay, one moment, please. Sorry about that. Okay. Severalty. A freehold interest. Severalty. A freehold interest held only by one person. Its root is severed. Ownership is in severalty is the ownership of real estate severed from any co-owners. Severalty. Co-ownership, or concurrent ownership, otherwise known as co-tenancy, is any freehold interest or ownership shared by two or more persons, including corporations. There are several types of co-ownership. Tenancy in common. Tenancy in common is the default form of co-ownership. Co-owners who purchase property without specifying a type of ownership own in common. Ownership interests may be equal or unequal, but all co-owners have an interest in the entire property that cannot be compromised. This type of co-ownership is inheritable. Joint tenancy. Joint tenancy is a type of co-ownership that must be chosen by all co-owners and specified in the deed. All owners must hold 4 unities to create a joint tenancy. The unity of possession. All have equal right of possession. The unity of time. All purchase the property at the same time. The unity of interest. All have equal interests in the property. And the unity of title. They all acquire in the same deed. Once the joint tenancy is created, it creates a right of survivorship. Survivorship means that if one of the co-owners dies, their interest is divided amongst the surviving co-owners evenly. A joint tenancy is therefore not inheritable. If one of the joint tenants sells their portion of the property, that portion of the property is removed from the joint tenancy. A joint tenancy can be completely terminated by agreement, or voluntary partition, court action or partition action, or the death of all joint tenants. If all joint tenants die except for one, the joint tenancy also ends, and the surviving owner owns in severalty. As a reminder, ownership in severalty is held by only one person. It is the ownership of real estate severed from any co-owners. It is a freehold interest. Tenancy by the entirety. Tenancy by the entirety is joint tenancy for married couples. It works the same as joint tenancy but includes creditor protections, a limitation on forced sale of the property to satisfy the debts of one spouse only. Debts must be in the couple's name for the home to be sold. In some cases, there is an automatic homestead protection for $125,000 and the ability to file for $500,000 of protection in some states. If the couple divorces, it defaults back to tenancy in common, unless the couple chooses otherwise. In separate property states, tenants by the entirety may sell or devise separately, similar to joint tenants. In community property states, on the other hand, the property acquired during marriage cannot be sold or devised without the consent of both spouses, since it is treated as the property of both spouses, even if only one actually bought it. Condominiums. Condominiums are a way to subdivide a building into separate units, creating fee simple ownership of the individual units and shared ownership of the common areas, hallways, elevators, a roof deck, etc. Just one moment. I'm sorry about that. So condominiums are a way to subdivide a building into separate units, creating fee simple ownership of the individual units and shared ownership of the common areas as tenants in common. Most states have condominium laws referred to as the Horizontal Property Act. The condominium is created via a master deed, which describes how the building and its condominium or homeowners association, otherwise known as the building's governing body, will be set up. A declaration of trust sets up a board of trustees to manage the condominium association. Bylaws of the association are the rules of the building. A building that is made into condominiums is also known as a condo conversion. Each individual condo owner owns their unit via a unit deed, along with a share of the common areas in proportion to the unit's fair market value. Owners are responsible for their proportionate share of common area expenses and pay them as monthly condo fees. Owners that fail to pay their condo fees are at risk of foreclosure. Failure to pay the fees can result in the condominium association placing a super priority lien for up to 6 months of unpaid fees against the unit. These fees run with the land. Hello. These fees run with the land, meaning they are the responsibility of the unit owner, and therefore are binding on subsequent property owners. Because of this, some states require a 6D closing certificate for the sale of every condominium unit. This certificate establishes the status of the condo fees as of the date the unit sold. That is a 6D closing certificate. Sale of every condominium unit. Watch out for common problems with condo buildings called special assessments. These are extra condo fees charged to repair or upgrade the building. A lack of capital reserves could be another problem with condominium buildings. Capital reserves are money held in a reserve fund account by condo associations and investors to pay for improvements to a property. Also watch out for common problems with condo buildings that have low owner occupancy rates. Cooperatives. Cooperatives are another way of structuring co-ownership in apartment buildings. Cooperative, a company, usually an LLC, is formed for the limited purpose of providing housing to its shareholders. The people living in the building own stock or shares in the company, or stock certificates, which gives them a right to a proprietary lease to their unit. They do not own their unit, instead they own the company that rents them their unit. This gives owners a significant amount of control over what goes on in the building, at the cost of ceding the same control to their neighbors. The cooperative will have a co-op board like a condominium board of trustees, and the owners will pay monthly co-op fees for building expenses similar to condo fees. Banks will typically accept stock in a cooperative as collateral for a loan. Because cooperatives are indirect ownership, the sale and purchase of cooperative units are subject to oversight and approval by the co-op board. It can be difficult to buy and sell co-op units because of this limitation. The property might also have debt in the name of the corporation itself, which must be paid on time, lest the corporation itself go into foreclosure. Cooperatives are typically created to permit their residents to limit unit ownership in some legally permissible way. The co-op board must approve the sale of co-op shares. This allows the creation of housing for a specific group of people, for example, artists-only housing. Any limitation on cooperative housing must be legal and comply with fair housing law. Trusts. Trusts are generally created during a person's life, a living trust, or upon their death, a testamentary trust. The person creating the trust, called the trustor, conveys property to a trustee who cares for the trust's assets, the assets being real estate, on the behalf of any beneficiaries, who are the people who receive the money from the trust. Land trusts are those trusts that only own real estate and do not include other assets. Often the beneficiary of a trust is also the truster, since the public record does not name the beneficiary as the owner of the property, and instead only names the trust, creating anonymity. They are also often used for land conservation. Land trusts typically last for some limited period of time, for example, 25 years. A way of dividing time rather than space in the property. Oh, sorry, this is timeshares. A way of dividing time rather than space in the property. Timeshares or time sharing is a form of ownership where the owner only owns a specific part of the year in fee simple, along with a shared interest in the common areas. The owner pays maintenance fees for the upkeep and maintenance of the unit year round. Time sharing is also known as interval ownership, a prepaid vacation, or a floating use period. So those are all different kinds of co-ownership. The different kinds of co-ownership include tenancy in common, joint tenancy, tenancy by the entirety, condominiums, cooperatives, trusts, and timeshares. Those are all different kinds of co-ownership. Tenancy in common is co-ownership. Joint tenancy, co-ownership. Tenancy by the entirety is co-ownership. Condominiums is co-ownership. Cooperatives is co-ownership. Trusts are co-ownership, and timeshares co-ownership. We're going to be talking about securities. Securities are investments, for example, stocks and bonds. There are a number of different types of securities. Different types of securities are syndications. They are legal entities that invest in a single piece or pieces of real estate. They take many forms. They could be partnerships, limited partnerships, corporations, an LLC, or otherwise known as a limited liability company, or more. They provide a return based on how a specific piece of real estate performs. Corporations are corporate persons under the law and can own real estate in severalty or in common with natural persons, actual humans. Investors in syndications can either be general partners, otherwise known as GPs, those with a management role, or limited partners, or LPs, who are passive investors who do not have a management role. Only general partners have full liability for the financial obligations of the partnership. Limited partners are only liable for their investment. Because limited partners are only liable for their investment, their tax deductions for losses in the syndication are also limited to their investment under the IRS's at-risk limitation rule. This rule says that LPs cannot deduct a loss greater than their total investment amount on their taxes, even if the syndication lost more amount. In contrast to syndications, REITs, real estate investment trusts, REMICs, real estate mortgage investment conduits, and REMTs, real estate mortgage trusts, are real estate investment vehicles. They allow indirect investment in either real estate itself or real estate loans and provide a return that is based on the performance of the national real estate market or a specific submarket. Why are we concerned with these investments? Because a person must have a securities license to market and sell interests in an investment vehicle like a syndication. Your real estate license does not enable you to sell investment in them. Federal and state law regulates securities and their sale, most notably blue sky laws, which protect the public from fraud on a state-by-state basis through the Securities and Exchange Commission, otherwise known as SEC, has largely preempted these laws. Non-freeholds. Non-freehold interests confer the possession and use of someone's real property without transferring ownership. For example, renting. In a rental, the lessor is the landlord and the lessee is the tenant. Leaseholds are a type of non-freehold. Leaseholds can also be referred to as tenancy for years, estate for years, or interest for years. They are a written conveyance of the possession real estate for a period of time. It must be in writing and have an expiration date. It must be in writing and have an expiration date. Leaseholds. Tenancy at will. A verbal or rarely written right to possess property without any specified term or stated interval. Either the lessee or lessor may terminate the agreement at any time. However, in some states, lessor or lessee must give 30-day notice to vacate in order to terminate a tenancy at will. A 30-day notice is required to terminate a tenancy at will. Periodic tenancy. It is like a tenancy at will but with fixed intervals, for example, month to month, and parties may terminate at the end of the period. Periodic tenancy means they can terminate at the end of the period, the predetermined fixed interval. Tenancy at sufferance. A holdover tenancy, and the tenant stays in the property past the lease expiration without the lessor's permission. Since the lessee is a tenant at sufferance and not a trespasser, the lessor must evict the tenant to regain possession of the property. Remember, the terms estate, tenancy, and interest can be used interchangeably. The exam will use all three, and you should be able to recognize terms regardless of which word is used. For example, you should know that tenancy in common and estate in common mean the same thing. Tenancy in common and estate in common, same thing. The different kinds of non-freehold interests are leaseholds, tenancy at will, periodic tenancy, and tenancy at sufferance. Non-freeholds are leaseholds, tenancy at will, periodic tenancy, sufferance. The section about interests in we will first study session there. Next week, tomorrow, I don't know when I limitations on property rights. Limitations on property rights next. Have a good night.